Guten Abend. Hören Sie mich? Ja. Guten Abend. Ich darf Sie heute ganz herzlich im Namen des Wiener Wiesenthal-Instituts für Holocaust-Studien bei unserer letzten Simon Wiesenthal Lecture 2019 begrüßen. Wir bedanken uns auch ganz herzlich beim Haus, Hof und Staatsarchiv und natürlich bei Ihnen, liebe Gäste, immer wieder fürs Kommen. And now I will switch to English. For our last Simon Wiesenthal lecture this year, we want to welcome Enzo Traverso, who will give a lecture on Rethinking Primo Levi. Enzo Traverso is the Susan and Barton Winocour Professor in the Humanities at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. His works deal with modern European intellectual history. His books are widely translated into many languages, and they include titles like The New Faces of Fascism from 2019, Left-Wing Melancholia, Marxism, History and Memory from 2017, and Fire and Blood, The European Civil War, 1914 to 1945, from 2016. Among the numerous books by Enzo Traverso that we have in our library, I want to especially point out L'Histoire déchirée, Essai sur Auschwitz et les intellectuels. I have it here, I will show it to you later on. Translated into German with the title Auschwitz Denken, die Intellektuellen und die Shoah, where he devotes a chapter to Jean Amery and Primo Levi's thinking. Interestingly, but not astonishing, we opened the Simon Wiesenthal lecture series this year, so in February 2019, with a lecture on Primo Levi in multilingual constellations, and multilingual constellation in his text by the literary scholar Mona Körte. And it seems that we have now come full circle with the year and with Primo Levi. So I want to welcome you once again, and we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts on rethinking Primo Levi.
So, vielen Dank für diese Einladung. Ich bin sehr zufrieden, hier zu sein. Und unglücklicherweise, mein gesprochenes Deutsch ist sehr schlecht und ich kann auf Deutsch einen ganzen Vortrag vorzustellen. Und so, meine gesprochene Englisch ist auch sehr schlecht. beide gesprochene so, aber ich hoffe, dass Sie können mir verstehen. So, I decided to focus my lecture on the memory of Primo Levi because this year we celebrate the anniversary of the birth of Primo Levi. He was born in Turin, Piedmont, precisely 1 century ago. So this is the main reason, but of course also because it seems to me that his work and his legacy is very relevant today and interesting to discuss. It would be banal and nevertheless true to start this presentation by emphasizing how much we miss the voice of Primo Levi today in times of rising xenophobia, racism, far-right movements, and even anti-Semitism throughout Europe and the US. At a time in which public intellectuals have almost disappeared in Italy. But I will avoid lamentation, which didn't belong to Primo Levi's style of thought. There are two ways of speaking about Primo Levi and the politics of the present. The first consists in inscribing him into the politics of his own present, which was significantly different from ours. And the second deals with the current uses of his work. These distinct levels of interpretation cross and merge, and it is almost impossible to carefully separate them, but this swinging between past and present reveals misunderstandings related to his legacy, which are interesting to consider. Misconceptions currently persist concerning Levi's position in Italian culture, his definition as a Jewish writer, and last but not least, his role as a literary witness of the Holocaust, a word he deeply disliked and with which today he is completely identified. I will try to analyze these topics sequentially. The destiny of classics is to be permanently used and reinterpreted, and Levi doesn't escape this rule. 20 years ago, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben wrote Remnant of Auschwitz, Quel che resta di Auschwitz, 1998, a remarkable book built on a sort of posthumous dialogue with Primo Levi, notably through a rereading of his last essay, The Drowned and the Saved, I sommersi e i salvati, 1986. I'm not sure that Levi would have shared Agamben's vision of the extermination camps as the biopolitical nomos of Western civilization and the naked life, la vita nuda, of the deported, the Muslim, as the modern expression of its subjacent paradigm, homo sacer. But this is not the point. Agamben's use of Primo Levi is perfectly legitimate. The point is that, regardless his own intentions, Agamben engendered the misconception of Levi as a forerunner of the so-called Italian theory, a current of thought represented by philosophers as diverse as Agamben himself, Toni Negri, Roberto Esposito, Mario Tronti, or Simona Forti. It seems to me that this renewal of Italian critical thought has entailed both the assimilation of Foucault and post-structuralism and a radical break with an intellectual tradition going from the Enlightenment to historicism, a tradition that precisely defines the philosophical horizon of Primo Levi. It is true that he pushed this tradition to its limits, almost putting it into question, but he still remained a critical enlightener, a writer for whom reality was a material, anthropological, cultural, and historical product rather than a linguistic construction or a semantic structure or a critical discourse. In spite of their missed dialogue, he probably shared Jean Améry's Stoic claim of a positivist spirit, the spirit of somebody who believes in experience, who clings to reality and its enunciation. Classicism and positivism are the pillars of his first books. If This Is a Man, Se questo è un uomo, 1947, is shaped into the model of Dantes Inferno, deportation as a fall into Hades, the camp with its circles, the inexhaustible variety of the pains inflicted on the inmates, and the great diversity of its characters, from his suffering comrades to the omnipotent torturers, whereas the truth, La Tregua, 1963, tells of his coming back to life, the journey that allowed him, after his liberation from Auschwitz in January 1945, and an interminable peregrination throughout Central Europe, to reach his home in Turin. Differently from Dante, however, his prose is naked, humble, sober, It is also opposed to the rhetoric of anti-fascism, to which he belonged nevertheless, a tradition to which he belonged nevertheless, which aimed at pronouncing moral sentences and spreading political messages. Beside Dante's literary model, If This Is a Man reveals a second fundamental source, which is a scientific paradigm. The legacy of a chemist who describes, orders, classifies, and scrutinizes the overwhelming experience endured in Auschwitz. The literary sensitivity of the writer and the analytical gaze of the chemist are the foundations of his entire work. The Nazi camps were for him an anthropological laboratory in which, beside the surreal destruction of lives, the human condition revealed its extreme limits. Of this anthropological laboratory, Levi was first a fragment, what the Nazi lexicon called technically a piece, Stück, id est a victim, and then a witness. Even more than a witness, an analyst. Witnesses always filter their experience through their own culture, select and interpret their recollections according to their own knowledge and questions. Witnesses ask themselves what is the meaning of their experience, of their lived experience, of their suffering, and their answers are neither unique nor immutable. In the eyes of Levi, the Holocaust remained a black hole, un buco nero, a definition borrowed from the language of natural sciences. But this mysterious abyss are to be explored, studied, and possibly understood. He explained, this is the legacy of his books, that it is impossible to investigate the Nazi camps without the testimony of the deportees. The point was not adding a touch of color or authenticity to a whole of facts clearly established. The point was using an irreplaceable source for understanding the extermination camps, for penetrating both the phenomenology and the meaning of an experience that transcended the archival materials and whose evidence its architects had tried to erase. This is why If This Is a Man has become a fundamental link in the chain of an open discussion on the conflictive yet nonetheless vital relationship between memory and history. This posture reveals a form of rationalism that Levi had inherited from his scientific education, a rationalism that had guided his career as a chemist and became a permanent feature of his mind. One of the lines describing the diagram that opens his personal anthology, The Search for Roots, La ricerca delle radici, 1981, reads, "The salvation of understanding, la salvazione del capire." It is marked by four names tracing from antiquity to the 20th century, a scientific and rational canon that had inspired his intellectual journey. Lucretius, Darwin, Bragg, and Clarke. As Levi stressed during his conversation with Tullio Regge, he was attached to a romantic vision of science, a science with a human face, he said, that carried on the joyful exploration of the Renaissance and Enlightenment scholars, antipodal to the lethal performances of instrumental reason. In his few science fiction stories, he warned against Promethean and totalitarian projects for dominating nature and annihilating humankind by means of modern technology. Primo Levi's work, as I emphasized above, has to be put under a pre-Foucauldian epistemic horizon, but his definition of Auschwitz as, I quote, a gigantic biological and social experience clearly suggests a definition of National Socialism as a biopolitical power. This is an example of how he reinterpreted and pushed to the limits the classical tradition from which he came. It does not belong to the so-called Italian thought, but the latter has found in his work many elements for building its own hypotheses and categories. It is interesting from this point of view to compare Levi with Jean Améry, Hans Mayer, the author of Jenseits von Schuld und Sühne, 1967, the Austrian writer and critic who was equally deported to Auschwitz, where he pretended having met Levi. Levi didn't remember him. Améry, too, claimed the legacy of Enlightenment, which he defined as a kind of philosophia perennis. He never denied his intellectual roots in the tradition of Austrian logical positivism, and he didn't hesitate to defend Sartre's humanism against the offensive of French structuralism, which he perceived as a betrayal. Interpreting history as a process without a subject, un processus sans sujet, according to the famous Louis Althusser definition, was nonsense. And the epistemological posture of Foucault, who stunningly proclaimed the death of subject, appeared to him as a provocation coming from the most dangerous enemy of Enlightenment, der gefährlichste Gegenaufklärer. As a staunch Aufklärer, Levi and Améry didn't endorse irrationalism or mysticism, and certainly wouldn't have subscribed to Elie Wiesel's famous sentence defining the Holocaust as an event transcending history. But a gap remained between explaining, spiegare, erklären, and understanding, capire, verstehen. Critical reason might explain Nazi violence and grasp its roots, describe its historical background and deconstruct its context, distinguish its steps and indicate its actors, analyze its internal logic and point out its peculiar combination of archaic mythology and rational modernity, a spiral resulting in complete destruction, but this is not yet understanding. All in all, Auschwitz remained, in their eyes, a black box of understanding. Levi defined it, as I said, a black hole, un buco nero, and Améry, a dark riddle, einem finsteren Rätsel. The attempts to explain the Holocaust through a Sonderweg, in which from Luther to National Socialism, Germany would have deviated from the path of a supposed Western paradigm of modernity, were ingenious ways out, just like the Marxist efforts to grasp in the Nazi crimes sometimes an economic rationality and sometimes the symptom of a late capitalism eclipse of reason. To the eyewitness, none of these explanations were satisfactory. None of them was able to resolve this black hole or dark riddle. They told them just as little as the sophisticated speculations about the dialectic of enlightenment. This posture should not be confused with that posteriorly formulated by Claude Lanzmann, the filmmaker of Shoah, which often took a mystical, almost almost obscurantist slant. Neither Améry nor Levi posited the incomprehensibility of the Holocaust. Hier ist kein Warum, there is no why, as an epistemological principle, as a dogma that automatically stigmatized as obscene any attempt to historical understanding. Améry and Levi didn't consider the Holocaust as a non-realm of memory, un non-lieu de mémoire, as a trauma that could only be absolutized, sacralized, resurrected by testimony, but neither transmitted nor historicized. They never thought to celebrate a defeat of the mind, nor to be considered as the prophets of a failure of critical reason. Not only did such a mystical posture not correspond with their mental habitus, but they probably would have rejected it as both ethically and politically unacceptable. Well, the second widespread misunderstanding of Primo Levi deals with his Jewishness, the tendency to classify him as a Jewish writer. Undoubtedly, Levi was a Jew. He never tried to hide this obvious fact. He had been persecuted and deported to Auschwitz as a Jew and spent most of his intellectual life bearing testimony to the Nazi extermination of the European Jews. Nonetheless, he was not a Jewish writer like Elie Wiesel, Aaron Appelfeld, or Philip Roth, to mention some of his contemporaries. The Italian Jewish writers of the 20th century deeply differed from their Israeli fellows, as well as from the New York intellectuals, however diverse the latter could be. Not only did he never consider himself as the representative of a religious community, his attachment to the tradition of science and enlightenment implied a radical form of atheism, which his experience of deportation strongly reinforced, even if he always expressed respectful feelings towards believers in his life as well as in his novels. But he probably never felt part of a Jewish milieu with clearly defined social and cultural boundaries. Rather than as an Italian Jew, a definition in which Jew is the substantive and Italian the adjective, he preferred to be depicted as an Italiano Ebreo, a Jewish Italian, in which Italian is the substantive and Jewish the adjective. Interviewed by Risa Sodi after his successful lecture tour of the United States in 1985, he stressed that in Italy, the notion of Jewish writer was very difficult to define. There, he said, I quote, "I'm known as a writer who, among other things, is Jewish." Whereas in the US, he felt, I quote, as if he had worn again the David Star. Of course, he was joking, but he wished to emphasize that his education and his cultural formation had not been particularly Jewish, and that most of his friends, as well as the overwhelming majority of the Italian readers of his books, were not Jewish. In a lecture given in 1982, he admitted that he had finally resigned himself to accept the label of Jewish writer, but I quote, "not immediately and not without reservations." This remark could be extended to most Jewish writers of 20th century Italian literature, from Italo Svevo to Alberto Moravia, from Giorgio Bassani to Natalia Ginsburg, and many others. Between 1938 and the end of the Second World War, it is between the promulgation of fascist racial laws and his liberation from Auschwitz, Levi probably fitted the famous Sartrean definition of the Jew. The Jew is one whom other men consider a Jew. For it is the anti-Semite who makes the Jew. C'est l'antisémite qui fait le juif. In a conversation with Ferdinando Camon, he mentioned his Jewishness as, I quote, a purely cultural fact. If not for racial laws and the concentration camp, he said, I probably would no longer be a Jew, except for my last name. Instead, this dual experience, the racial law and the concentration camp, stamped me the way you stamp a steel plate. At this point, I'm a Jew. They have sewn the Star of David on me, and not only on my clothes. Levi certainly was a godless Jew, gottloser Jude, as Peter Gay depicted Sigmund Freud. But he probably wouldn't have inscribed himself into the noble gallery of those whom Isaac Deutscher called the non-Jewish Jews, it is, the Jewish heretics. After the war, Primo Levi didn't feel targeted by anti-Semitism and considered emancipation from religious alienation and obscurantism as a legacy of the Enlightenment rather than a task of the present. He didn't consider himself as an iconoclast or a dissenter within Judaism. He simply wasn't a believer, a religious man. In many articles and interviews, Levi repeatedly affirmed that his Italian roots shaped his way of writing. Books such as the periodic table, Il sistema periodico, or the wrench, La chiave a stella, celebrate the Piedmontese Jewish culture and even the Piedmont dialect, but had to be projected into a broader world. Auschwitz was the paradoxical locus where, as an Italian Jew, he discovered cosmopolitanism. One of the first chapters of If This Is a Man, significantly titled Initiation, depicts the camp as a Tower of Babel, where people spoke dozens of languages and where the capacity to overcome these linguistic boundaries became a condition of survival. Like The Truth, this book offers an extraordinary gallery of characters belonging to different cultures, from Poles to Russians, from Ukrainians to Greeks, from Frenchmen to Germans, as well as to different social layers, but merged in a world in which all traditional cleavages and hierarchies were turned upside down. Whereas in Italy, as a Jew, he was a member of a minority, in Auschwitz, his particularism was Italian, not Jewish. In both If This Is a Man and The Truth, his Italian origins become a prism through which he discovers and describes other cultures distant and unknown to him. This is true, first of all, for Yiddish culture, which appeared very strange, not to say exotic, to an Italian Jew. But he also reversed this gaze. In the eyes of a Russian or a Polish Jew, the image of a Jew in a gondola or on the top of Vesuvius was just as exotic. Today, Auschwitz has become the locus par excellence of a Western memory of the Holocaust, but the word he described in such a colorful and sympathetic way is an Eastern Jewish, Slavonic, Yiddish, Central European, and Balkan word. And the richness of his books lies in this contrast. In Auschwitz, he learned the existence of a national Jewry, with its own language and culture, made of traditions, practices, and rituals. His last novel, If Not Now, When? Se non ora quando, 1982, is a saga of the Jewish resistance in Poland, experienced as a sort of national redemption. He was fascinated by this Judaism, a Judaism of which he had learned the history, celebrated the greatness, and mourned the destruction, but which was not his own word. Against the cliché portraying the modern Jewish intellectual as a figure of exile and extraterritoriality, Levi was a striking example of rootedness in a national society, language, and culture. We could almost speak of physical roots if we simply recall the words with which he evoked his family house in Turin when he was born on July 31, 1919, and where he committed suicide on April 11, 1987. Presenting himself as an, quote, extreme example of sedentary life, he wrote that he had become encrusted in his apartment as seaweed, quote, fixes itself on a stone, builds its shell, and doesn't move anymore for the rest of his life. He passionately described the streets, the river, and the surrounding mountains of Turin, as well as the austere and industrious character of its inhabitants. In 1976, he portrayed his town with the following words, quote, I'm very linked to my little fatherland, la mia piccola patria. I was born in Turin. All my ancestors were Piedmontese. In Turin, I discovered my vocation. I studied at university. I have always lived. I have written and published my books with a publisher very rooted in this town, despite its international reputation. I like this town. Its dialect, its streets, its paving stones, its boulevards, its hills, its surrounding mountains I scaled when I was young. I like the Highlander and country origins of its population. End of quote. In short, he was a rooted writer who needed a deep anchorage in a particular social, cultural, national, and even regional background in order to express the universality of his themes and messages. Maybe, he added, it was because of this remarkable rootedness that the journey was the topos of so many of his books. Just as his melancholic enlightenment was antipodal to the cult of science and conquering technology, his sedentary life was neither provincial nor nationalist. For him, science was not a blind instrumental rationality, rather a universal language inseparable from classical humanism, a category he never put into question, differently from postmodernism or post-structuralism. Likewise, his Italian identity, both Jewish and Piedmontese, was able to enter into dialogue with any culture, just as how Fausone, the hero of La Chiave a Stella, traveled around the world to build bridges, barrages, and power plants. From this point of view, the paths of Levi and Améry completely divided. Jean Améry never might have written a hopeful book like Primo Levi's The Truth, the account of a redemption, a rebirth, and a return to life. After his deportation, he couldn't come back to any homeland. Auschwitz was the final, irreversible loss of any possible Heimat. For him, life could only continue as a definitive exile without any possibility of return. He used to say he had, quote, learned to be homeless. Living in Brussels and speaking fluent French, nourished by French literature and philosophy, he probably could have become a French writer. But he decided to pursue a career as a German critic and novelist. And in this sense, his exile was an intellectual and existential choice. Like many other exiles, notably Paul Celan, the German language became his only home. This statement appears in many autobiographical texts as a kind of useful or unavoidable reminder. Home, homeland, for me they remain words without meaning. I was at home nowhere. The contrast with Primo Levi's rootedness couldn't be stronger. A third misunderstanding of Primo Levi's work deals with his role as a witness. After his death, he has been canonized as a witness par excellence of the Holocaust, and thus achieved the status of a paradigmatic victim, which he didn't have during his life. He wrote most of his books at a time in which the Holocaust had not yet entered our common historical consciousness as a central event of the 20th century, or even in broader terms of Western civilization. When he published If This Is a Man, the word Holocaust didn't exist for defining the Nazi extermination of the Jews, and later he pointed out that this word, etymologically meaning a sacrifice offered to the gods, was inappropriate, rhetorical, and finally mistaken. When he died, the age of the witness had already started, but had not reached its peak yet. The memorial turn in Western culture, I refer to the rise of memory as a central topic of public debates, the cultural industry, and academic scholarship, took place precisely in the middle of the 1980s. Its symbolical landmarks were successful books such as Zachor, 1982, by Joseph Chaim Yerushalmi in the US, Realms of Memory, Les Lieux de Mémoire, 1984, the collective volumes edited by Pierre Nora, and Shoah, 1985, a 9-hour movie by Claude Lanzmann in France. The so-called Historiker Streit around the Nazi past that will not pass in Germany. And precisely The Drowned and the Saved, 1986, by Primo Levi himself in Italy. Thus, Levi powerfully contributed to the emergence of memory in the public sphere, but this happened at the end of his life, and most of his work should be located before this memorial turn. He observed this change with a critical eye, I would say with a certain skepticism, and felt unsettled by these metamorphoses in both the perception and the representation of the past, as his last testamentary essay clearly shows. Two features of this new era of commemorations are particularly significant. First, the transformation of the remembrance of the Holocaust into a sort of civil religion of the West, and second, its separation from the memory of Antifascism, which had been a hegemonic memory for 3 decades in post-war Italy. The civil religion of the Holocaust, I think Peter Novick was the first scholar to coin this concept, aims at aims at making sacred the foundational values of our democracies by commemorating the Jewish victims of National Socialism in a liturgical, institutionally ritualized way. It turns the survivors into iconic figures who witness violence and human suffering in their own bodies. In short, homines sacri, in the opposite sense of Agamben's definition, not the ones permissible to kill, but rather the selected ones to be commemorated. Rereading Levi's last essay, The Drowned and the Saved, today, many of his remarks sound like warnings against the dangers of this civil religion of the Holocaust. He always rejected the temptation to turn victims into heroes. He refused to present the survivors as the best, those who put up the most relentless resistance to oppression. As he explained, his survival in Auschwitz was fortuitous, simply a matter of luck. The chemistry exam that spared him from being immediately selected for the gas chambers, the extra soup ration which he received daily from his friend Lorenzo Perrone, and his sickness in January 1945 at the moment of the evacuation of the camp, which spared him the death marches. Thus, he deliberately chose to write If This Is a Man by adopting the calm and sober language of the witness, not the complaining voice of the victim, not the angered tone of revenge. He refused to judge and played his role as a witness with great humility. Quote, "The history of the Nazi camps has been written almost exclusively by those who, like myself, never fathomed them to the bottom. Those who did so didn't return, or their capacity for observation was paralyzed by suffering and incomprehension. The survivors could witness their experience, a fragment of the historical event in which they had been involved, and their testimony didn't reveal any transcendent truth. In other words, the drowned, I sommersi, who had been swallowed up by the gas chambers, couldn't come back to bear witnesses. But they, rather than the survivors, were the complete witnesses, I testimoni integrali. In The Drowned and the Saved, he wrote that the survivors were not only an exiguous but also an anomalous minority. They were those who, by their prevarications or abilities or good luck, didn't touch bottom. Those who did so, those who saw the Gorgon, have not returned to tell about it or have returned mute, but they are the Muslims, not in a religious meaning of the word, but Muselman in Auschwitz meaning of the word. The submerged, the complete witnesses, the ones whose deposition would have general significance. They are the rule. We are the exception. End of the quote. When Levi wrote about the ethical and political duty of witnessing carried out by the Holocaust survivors, this formula had not yet become a rhetorical topos of the dominant discourse on memory. He stressed that the survivors not only couldn't, they wouldn't forget and wanted the world not to forget because they felt forgetting to be the most dangerous threat. Overcoming the past, the Bewältigung der Vergangenheit. This catchword, Levi observed, is a stereotype, a euphemism of today's Germany, where it is universally understood as redemption from Nazis. When he wrote these words in the middle of the 60s, a Holocaust memorial in the heart of Berlin was simply unthinkable. In Levi's writings, memory never appears as a Hegelian Aufhebung, overcoming the contradictions of history. Its function is cognitive, not allowing repair or reconciliation. We can learn from history, but the past cannot be redeemed. At best, recollections could fulfill a therapeutic function, as for writing If This Is a Man, an act he experienced as, I quote, the equivalent of Freud's divan. In short, Levi's claim of the duty of memory has been consecrated in our age of obsession for the past, but it was conceived of in a time of collective amnesia. The duty of memory is not a timeless and universal principle. It needs to be historicized. Memory of the offense means facing some fundamental ethical issues, notably that of guilt, both individual and collective, and pardon. On this point, Levi's approach didn't coincide completely with that of Améry. In Jenseits von Schuld und Sühne, the latter pointed out that, quote, nothing is resolved, no conflict is settled, no remembering, erinnern, has become mere memory, blossen Erinnerung. What happened, happened. But that it happened cannot be so easily accepted. I rebel against my past, against history, and against a present that places the incomprehensible and the cold in the cold storage of history, and thus falsifies it in a revolting way. In the 1960s, historicizing National Socialism meant, first of all, turning the page, or, according to the conventional formula, Bewältigung der Vergangenheit, coming to terms with the past. Améry sarcastically evoked this formula in the subtitle of his essay, Bewältigungsversuche eines Überwältigten. Reconciliation was an empty word if it didn't mean the resentment of the victims on the one hand, and on the other hand, the self-mistrust, Selbstmisstrauen of the offenders. Such a recognition of historical responsibility, unescapable even for the generation that came after the war, in his view, was the only premise for remaking history, that is, metaphorically, turning time back, and moralizing it, Moralisierung der Geschichte. A similar posture inspired Jürgen Habermas in the 80s during the Historikerstreit, when he claimed against Ernst Nolte and the apologetic tendencies of historiography the inscription of the Holocaust into the German historical consciousness as the premise of his claimed Verfassungspatriotismus. Levi didn't express a similar resentment. His obstinate trust in the virtues of human reason was the deepest source of his anthropological optimism. Quote, to my short and tragic experience of being deported, he wrote in 1976, another one, more complex and longer, was superposed, that of rider and witness. The result was clearly positive. Because such a past enriched and consolidated me. Living, writing, and meditating on my experience, I have learned a lot about men and their word. End of quotation. Améry didn't share this view and accused Levi of being a forgiver, Vergeber. Levi denied this the allegation, but at the same time confessed that he couldn't share the Austrian-Belgian writer's resentment. In the last pages of The Truce, La Tregua, Levi described the Germans he saw in Munich in October 1945 as a mass of insolvent debtors, debitori insolventi. And in his correspondence with Dr. Ferdinand Meyer, one of the German chemists at the IG Farben laboratory of Buna Monowitz in Auschwitz, he refused to pardon him. I would like to help you to come to terms with your past, he wrote, but I doubt that I'm able. Nevertheless, he accepted the principle of forgiveness. To forgive and even love one's enemies is possible, he wrote, but only when they show unequivocal signs of repentance, in other words, when they cease to be enemies. Curiously, Levi didn't quote the best known and most controversial book on this subject, Die Schuldfrage, 1945, by the philosopher Karl Jaspers, who had tried to distinguish different aspects of German guilt: penal, political, personal, and metaphysical guilt. Like the German philosopher, however, Levi raised the problem of our historical responsibility for the past. In short, Levi couldn't forgive his persecutors, but didn't share Ameri's resentment. Both of them recognized that they had been incapable of expressing joy when they were liberated in Auschwitz. Stripped of any material and spiritual resource, they couldn't express any such feeling. But after this common admission, their paths diverged. According to Amery, Auschwitz violence had broken human beings' faculty to communicate, making them strangers to the world. Levi, on the contrary, could still see among the skeletal figures of the death camps a remote possibility of good. Una remota possibilità di bene. These debates of the post-war years on guilt and victimhood belong to a finished time, when the past legacy heavily burned the present. Today, the civil religion of the Holocaust tends to depoliticize memory, focusing on innocent victims as objects of compassion. It has emerged from a radical break with anti-fascist memory, which focused on the celebration of fallen fighters. It is not by accident that the rise of the Holocaust memory has corresponded with the decline of anti-fascist memory, like in a system of communicating vessels. In many of his writings, Levi distinguished between Jewish and political deportation. In his eyes, this difference shouldn't be hidden or diminished, but neither should it be stressed as a separating line. He had been deported as a Jew, but had been arrested as a partisan. And when he wrote If This Is a Man, after coming back to Turin, he decided to publish some chapters in a small magazine of Piedmontese resistance, L'Amico del Popolo. In his views, Jewish and anti-fascist memories could only exist together as twin memories. In 1978, Levi wrote a short text for the Italian pavilion of the Auschwitz Museum, which is a strong defense of anti-fascism. In the last decades, this pavilion, commissioned by the ANED, National Association of Ex-Deportees, and realized by a team of committed authors, the architect Ludovico di Belgioioso, the componist Luigi Nono, and the painter Mario Samonà, had become a realm of memory of Italian anti-fascism. But it no longer fitted the current standards of public memory and was finally closed. Anti-fascism, a particular form of anti-fascism made of a fusion of the critical Enlightenment and left-wing republicanism, was the political background of Primo Levi. But he never claimed the anti-fascist rhetoric of post-war Italy. His books are far away from the epic and heroic tales of a resistance struggle for national liberation. In The Drowned and the Saved, he described himself as the worst of the partisans, lacking physical courage, experience, and political education. And he emphasized that his career as a partisan had been very, quote, brief, painful, stupid, and tragic. I had taken a role that wasn't mine. The tragic legacy of his experience as a partisan is summarized in a handful of passages of the periodic table, which Sergio Luzzatto magisterially analyzed, reinterpreted, and explained a few years ago. Levi referred to an ugly secret, un brutto segreto, the execution of two of his comrades accused of betrayal, something quite common in partisan warfare, that burdened his consciousness and destroyed him psychologically, depriving him of the necessary resources for carrying on the struggle. In the last years of his life, which were punctuated by repeated and deepening depressions, he grew obsessed with the gray zone, la zona grigia, the area of indistinctness where the boundaries between persecutors and victims, good and evil, were blurred. An ambiguous space whose incredibly complicated internal structure hindered the faculty of judgment. It was in this period that he depicted the Muslim, the dehumanized inmate, the embodiment of another intermediate area suspended between life and death, as the complete witness of the Nazi camps. Survivors were simply vicarious representatives of these complete witnesses who could not speak. Levi remained a melancholic enlightener, but his optimism had disappeared. He bore testimony without considering himself, due to being a survivor, as a true witness, and defended anti-fascism in spite of portraying himself as a pitiful partisan. In short, he believed in the necessary search for truth, but he never preached truths. He rather tried to excavate them, to problematize them, by both recognizing their contradictions and exploring their darkest shadows. This critical skepticism didn't spare his Jewish identity and his role as a witness. In 1967, he took a position in defense of Israel, which he felt was threatened with destruction, defining it in several interviews as his second homeland. In 1982, at the moment of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, he denounced this aggression and warned against the birth of a paradoxical form of Israeli fascism. Fascism was the word he employed, embodied by leaders such as Menachem Begin, whom he stigmatized as a disciple of Jabotinsky, an admirer of Mussolini. He knew that many of the founders of Israel had been people who, like him, had survived the Holocaust but couldn't come back to their homes. This was a matter of fact, but it didn't immunize them nor Israel against fascism. This was another dimension of the gray zone. In an interview in 1983, Primo Levi admitted his exhaustion. He no longer wished to meet pupils and students who repeated the same questions, but he also added that he was not satisfied by his own answers. He described having been deeply unsettled by the question asked by two adolescents in a school. Why do you still come to tell us your story 40 years later, after Vietnam, the Stalin camps, and Cambodia? After all this, why? He remained in front of them, voiceless, mouth agape, as a witness retreating back into himself. His convictions, his pedagogical talents and rhetorical skills, his long career of witnessing suddenly seemed useless in front of this simple question. He felt overwhelmed by shame, the human shame he had discovered in Auschwitz and which he met again translating the trial of Kafka. The past is an inexhaustible receptacle of materials for literary creation, but unfortunately, history is not a magistra vitae. And thank you for your passions.
So thank you for this new and again reading of Primo Levi and this also invitation to rediscover really his texts and not only all his interpretations and appropriations, because that is what actually happens in the context of canonization. And when authors enter the canon of world literature, there are a lot of, as I understood you, a lot of misreadings, misconceptions, even mistranslations, I would say. So some points that you have mentioned, I just picked the ones that seemed relevant to me and I have missed a lot, was to rediscover actually Primo Levi, his reflections on witnessing opposed to experience maybe, or to discover the the Tower of Babel of Auschwitz, and the notion of rootedness, but in a very particular way of a small rootedness, I understood that. And also to rediscover his reflections on memory, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and history as redemption, and and all this talk of coming to terms with the past. So I open the floor here for your questions.
Thank you for this great talk. How would you interpret this ongoing persistence or even exaggeration of the cult of the victim since the 80s? As you mentioned, it started in the first half of the 80s, and probably the reasons were the depolitization of history, memory. But it's going on, and it's becoming even more sacred or religious in a way.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. And it seems to me that we have to contextualize Primo Levi's observations and also to some extent, I would say, conceptualization of the figure of the victim. So Primo Levi paid attention to the figure of the victim at a time in which the victims were marginalized in the public sphere, in the public debate, in a time in which commemorations of the Nazi camps focused on the figures of the fighters. So the heroes were the resistance fighters. And Primo Levi at that time paid attention to the victims. So when he died, at the middle of the 80s, so this was precisely a historical turning point. The moment of a very significant shift from the age of public memory focused on the fighters to a public memory focused on the figures of the victims. So there is a kind of anachronism in using Levi today or in recodifying or in reinterpreting today Levi's writings on memory and the victims in a time in which these categories were displaced, were completely transformed. And what is particularly significant in my view is the fact that the emergence of the figure of the victim corresponds with the eclipse of the figure of the vanquished. It would be interesting. It would be interesting to analyze this topic. For instance, the enormous critical literature that exists on Walter Benjamin, and Walter Benjamin, philosophy of history, usually skips this central point in Benjamin's vision of history. History from the point of view of the vanquished. And what happened in the last decades was a progressive assimilation of the vanquished to the victims. In order to be recognized, the vanquished have to be assimilated to the victims, and the victims are, by definition, by nature, innocent. And this is the tendency to, well, a simple example, the military dictatorships in Latin America have been progressively assimilated to the Holocaust. The Holocaust has become a kind of paradigm of many memory building processes. And so it seems to me, from an epistemological point of view, very problematic, this tendency. Because there is a difference between a Jewish child who is deported and exterminated in a gas chamber. He is a victim. We cannot define him otherwise. So he is a victim, and a guerrillero who was persecuted and exterminated because of his political commitment, or the tendency to reinterpret the history of the Spanish Civil War as a genocide. One of the most successful books on the Spanish Civil War published in the last years, the Spanish Holocaust by Paul Preston, is an attempt to assimilate the Spanish Civil War to a genocide. And this is almost necessary in order to give recognition to the Republicans, Spanish Republicans, who were killed during the Spanish Civil War. But this emergence of the figure of the victim as a kind of universal figure is an attempt at the same time to depoliticize history, the past, and memory, and historical consciousness. And I'm very skeptical with respect to this tendency, and it seems to me that so it would be interesting to look at the use of Levi from this point of view. Because, as I said, Levi wrote his short text for the Italian pavilion of Auschwitz, of the Auschwitz Museum, which is an anti-fascist text, which is a text, is a mirror of the anti-fascist memory and culture of the 70s in Italy. So this has been, so this dimension of Levi's work has been completely marginalized because it doesn't fit our memory rules today.
Thank you. That was a wonderful hour. You finished on a really difficult question. And I was wondering, why do you think we still need to talk about the Holocaust after Vietnam and Stalin and Cambodia?
Well, I without being Levi, I could answer with a similar astonishment and voiceless attitude. So, at the same time, Levi never resigned. So he never was. So resignation is something that doesn't belong to his mental habitus. But so he problematized the past, he problematized history. For instance, he always distinguished between the Nazi camps and the Gulag. He didn't accept the equivalence between them. But at the same time, he permanently elaborated a reflection on this comparison. This comparison for him was unavoidable, was necessary, was politically, ethically, not only politically and ethically legitimated, but also, I would say, epistemologically useful and fruitful. But his conclusion was that, so we cannot assimilate them. And I think that this posture, this intellectual posture, is a very fruitful legacy. So I identified with this kind of fruitful doubt.
First, thank you for your excellent lecture. If you allow, I would like to put to you 3 questions. The first is, an Austrian author, Mr. Menasse, has written a novel with the title of Capital. And there he requests that the capital of Europe should be Auschwitz. The capital of Europe should be Auschwitz. What would Levi have said of this idea? My second question is, you have said that Levi was not deported, if I understood correctly, as a Jew, but as a partisan, and that two of his comrades were shot. So if he was a partisan and taken prisoner as a partisan, he was extremely lucky to have survived, because normally with partisans they dealt in a very short manner. So could you elaborate on that he was taken as a partisan, two of his comrades were shot and he deported. Naturally also in the end as a Jew, but mainly as a partisan apparently, if I understood you correctly. And my third question is a question of relationships. Was he akin to Carlo Levi? The two are excellent authors as far as I know. I'm neither a specialist of the one. I've read something of one and something of the... I've seen the beautiful film on Carlo Levi's Christ has come only to Eboli. So my question is, as both have similar subjects in their novels, and naturally Carlo Levi was a bit older than he, but was there a kinship between them or not at all? And as he was in Turin there was another famous Italian philosopher, very much linked to the Enlightenment, that's Norberto Bobbio. What was the relationship? There must have been some relationship, I think, between Primo Levi and Norberto Bobbio.
So many questions. I will try to answer separately. The first question is the most important, or I think. So perhaps at the end, before. So Levi was arrested as a partisan and was deported as a Jew. So, and he thought when he was arrested that depicting himself as a partisan, what he was, he would have been immediately executed. So he said, I'm a Jew, and he was deported as a Jew.
He survived due to his...
Yeah, but he didn't know at that time what Auschwitz meant. So we have to contextualize this. And he belonged to the same milieu, intellectual milieu in Turin of Carlo Levi. Il cuore antico dell'orologio is, I don't know how it has been translated into English or German, but so it's there are some essays written by Carlo Levi which could be compared to Primo Levi's writings. So, and of course, Norberto Bobbio was a leading representative of this current, which was anti-fascist, in which a very peculiar intellectual and political current of Italian anti-fascism, which was neither communist nor Catholic, that was related to the tradition of the so-called Italian liberal socialismo, liberal socialism, I fratelli Rosselli, Gobetti at the beginning of the 20s. So a political and intellectual current which could be defined Republican, clearly anti-fascist, and so deeply rooted in, or inscribed, rooted in this tradition of Turin's Enlightenment. So you know that in Italy there are Naples and Turin as the two capitals. Naples, the capitals of Italian, the tradition of Italian idealism, and so Hegel was mostly interpreted in the south of, and
With regard to Karl, really my question went a bit not only the intellectual but the personal. So was there uncle and nephew?
yeah, they belonged. So they had family links. Yeah, they were related. Yeah, but I don't know. So they met regularly. They knew each other very well. I don't know the degree of intimacy between them. I don't know that. The question of the execution of the partisans. So I think that so this is an hypothesis advanced, formulated by Sergio Luzzatto, that during his entire life, Primo Levi was obsessed, taraudé, we could say in French, I don't know. So by this traumatic experience. So his career as a partisan was extremely short and finished tragically. So Sergio Luzzatto's book provoked violent polemics in Italy. And so we can interpret it in different ways. So he formulated some hypotheses. We can't say whether it's true or not that Levi was obsessed during all his life by this experience. So this experience, which was quite common, executions of traitors or supposed traitors. In this case, they were two very young guys, so 18 years old. So, and so after the war, this execution of traitors was masked as fascist repression, and they became heroes of resistance. So, and Levi was extremely unsettled and disturbed but at the same time, he never decided to, so he, in a very, not ambiguous, but very vague ways, referred to this event in some of his books. But so this was something that he was unable to elaborate, differently from, so he wrote extensively on very, very complicated questions, so guilt, pardon, when they were not simple questions, he didn't fear to face directly these questions. So his experience as a partisan, and so his relationship with this tradition of anti-fascism was clearly assumed, claimed, but not, at least in his texts, not problematized as his Jewishness, for instance. And so with respect to the question of Auschwitz, capital of Europe, today I would be against this option for many political considerations. But I said,
what would Levi think? You are against that.
But Levi never faced this a debate or never contemplated this option, but I remember now that that in the 60s, at the time of the Russell Tribunal, if I remember well, Günther Anders suggested that the Russell Tribunal would take place in Auschwitz. So in order to, and at that time, this was a very provocative, and I think that at that moment, these provocations were extremely fruitful. So it was a way to establish a link between the Vietnam War, the colonial genocides, and Auschwitz. And that was at that time, in symbolic terms, a way to show what was subjacent dimension of Western European anti-colonialism. In France, at that time, for instance, so the legacy of the war, the legacy of the Jewish deportation, and the legacy of anti-Semitism played a very important role in radicalizing many Jewish intellectuals against the Algerian war and in supporting the struggle for Algerian national liberation. So at that moment, such an option would have had a very strong impact. Today, it seems to me that such an option could only raise misunderstandings and could only develop and deepen what is called in so current debates. I don't like this expression, but it describes the reality, the competition between the victims. So it seems to me that such an option today would deepen the gap that exists today, unfortunately, and so between the memory of the Holocaust and the post-colonial memories.
No, you would immediately get the answer that you kind of deny the singularity of the Holocaust. Today, I would say that's the point. That immediately was that the answer that you, okay.
Yeah.
May I continue with the question? No? Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah. No, coming back to the figure of the victim, and you connected it, when I understood you correctly, with the depolitization of the memory of the Holocaust. Did I understand you correctly? When, I mean, I also would agree with that the memory of the Holocaust is more or less a depolitization of history at the moment. But when did this happen? When was this kind of turning point that the memory of the Holocaust lost its kind of political dimension and became a ritual or whatever?
Yeah, so I would like to avoid some misunderstandings. I don't think that this depoliticization of the memory of the Holocaust is the product of a strategy of so an attempt at depoliticizing the memory of the Holocaust in order, I don't know, to defend apologetic views with respect to Israel, or, well, I don't believe in plots in history. But it seems to me that this depoliticization, which is a fact, that we can observe, we can analyze, we can interpret in different way, is certainly not related to a political strategy carried out by Jewish associations, memorial associations, or the survivors themselves, is a tendency deeply related to historical change that occurred in the 80s and that reached its climax with so in 1989 with the collapse of real socialism, and the depoliticization of the memory of the Holocaust is deeply related to a historical defeat of socialism as one of the options that shaped the political culture of the 20th century. So in my view, this is extremely simple and evident. There is almost a mechanical relationship between that. So we cannot analyze the memory of the Holocaust as something that could be studied, interpreted in vitro as a process. So it's something connected by a lot of links with a general historical context that was shaped by the defeat of the revolutions, the socialist revolutions of the 20th century. And this depoliticization also affected the memory of the Holocaust.
Is there still a question? One more? Two questions. Okay.
Maybe the question, it could be connected to that one, but it's a bit more shallow. I've been to Italy this summer, and I was quite surprised that I found books of Primo Levi at, for example, tobacco stores or newspaper stands. Not only the comic book or the graphic novel, but also like writings of him. So I was wondering if you could say something about the adoption of Primo Levi in Italy today, or the public image of Primo Levi today in Italy, especially since you mentioned his regional rootedness there. Yeah. Thank you.
No, I think that Levi has become in Italy a kind of how to say it, of neutral iconic figure, completely at the same time inoffensive and useless. So it's universally recognized, so everybody is proud of Primo Levi, one of the most famous representatives of Italian literature in the world. And this means, so canonization means seminars, conferences, books, and so on and so on. But, well, the book of Sergio Luzzatto was interesting because provocatively renewed this debate. Otherwise, Gramsci is a classic. Has been canonized, but so in the last 30 years, in Italy, many books have been published on Gramsci, but I certainly wouldn't say that the most interesting books on Gramsci have been published in Italy. So the reception of Gramsci in India, for instance, by the subalternists is much more interesting than the eternal exegetical works on Gramsci. Or also we could say the same for many other authors. So Levi has become this kind of canonic figure, universally accepted, but so whose critical dimension has been neutralized. So there is an enormous discrepancy between Primo Levi in today's Italy and Primo Levi when he was a public intellectual in Italy in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s. But so we should open another chapter on what is Italy today. So the rise of xenophobia, racism, and also anti-Semitism most recent weeks in Italy. Yeah.
Is it the same who wrote this great book about Mussolini?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think there was one more question, and then we will have to.
Yeah. Thank you for this very stimulating talk. You have called Primo Levi several times a melancholic enlightener and melancholic different other things. As we know, melancholia has different colors and shades. So how do you situate Primo Levi in the left-wing melancholia as you outlined it in your book 3 years ago? Is he part and parcel of this kind of melancholia, or is this a different kind of melancholia altogether?
I think it's a different kind of melancholia. Because Primo Levi was a public intellectual clearly belonging to the field of the left. But he never, he supported some radical, some movements of the radical left in the 70s, but Primo Levi never shared the, we could say, the utopia or the myth of socialist future, of liberation through a collective revolution or uprising. So he belonged to this tradition of liberal socialism, and his melancholia, I think, was mostly related to his Jewishness. I think that he felt burdened by these so heavy and difficult past, and so finally he felt he was no longer able to translate it into political options, proposals, or ideas. So, and he had been during his entire life subject to repeated depressions. So he is always depicted as an optimist, and he was an optimist. He depicted himself as an optimist. He claimed this kind of anthropological optimism, but this posture couldn't remove or hide sadness, very deep, that inhabited him. So this was his melancholia that was, in my view, more related to his identity as an intellectual, as a Jew. And so it was an existential melancholia more than a political melancholia. So this is the reason for which I didn't include him in my book on the left-wing melancholia.
So, yes, thank you once again. Yeah. Thank you for this invitation to actually not accept these iconic imageries and figures, but to look into the complexities and ambiguities. So I just, for now, I want to close this year with an advertisement for our last public event. Next week, our last public event this year, 2019, will be at 7 p.m. on 17th of December in the bookshop Singer, and it will be a book presentation and a reading of Szymon Anski's Talkbuchaufzeichnungen von polnischen Churben. So the title is The Churben in Polen, Galizien und der Bukowina. And there will be a reading in Yiddish and German. Yes, and then this is the closing of the year, and then the next year begins with the next Simon Wiesenthal lecture by Paul Hanebrink, A Spectre Haunting Europe, the Myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, on the 16th of January here again. So, yes. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.